people who are worried about unmerited power or unaccountable wealth, the royal family are the least of your problems.
The king is by far the most important diplomat that we in this country possess.
Hello and welcome to Quite Right's Questions and Answers. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer.
And this week we'll be asking, off with their heads. Should we really get rid of the royal family? We'll also be considering the future of a particular part of Somerset and a hero who may return to save the country. King Arthur or King Jacob? And we will also be considering, is it the case that you move rightwards as you get older? Or is that old Saul now old hat? Our first question is from Roderick Richards. And Roderick asks, given the shameless and seemingly self-unaware behaviour of certain members of the royal family, is it not time for Britain to change its relationship with the royals? No more public engagements, removed from the legislative process, paying tax and so on.
I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question there. Do I think that the whole royal family, the 1,000 years of history that it represents, and an institution that remains popular should be completely destroyed as any sort of force in national life because of the staggeringly terrible behaviour of Andrew and Fergie? No, I don't. I think that would be kind of like if we decided that the Lord Mandelson affair would suggest that we should never have a US ambassador again. The institution still commands actually comparatively great loyalty with the British public. In recent decades, there's been a great collapse in trust and support for many national institutions. And actually, I think when you look at the general disillusionment with so many things at the moment, the royal family support for the monarchy has held up fairly well. If you're a Republican, I don't think the monarchy is like in your face and forcing you to supplicate yourself or to watch. You don't have to watch the King's speech, but there are an awful lot more people who feel very strongly about the monarchy that it's a good thing. And I think if it was suddenly removed from public life, that would lead to real unhappiness. It would also be a bureaucratic nightmare. You'd have to completely change many institutions of their own. For example, the army, which swears allegiance to the crown, the Church of England, an intimate link with the royal family to the crown that would also have to be changed. The point about tax and money is interesting. I think it's slightly unfair because the sovereign grant is money that is already taken out of the crown profits and is then some of it is filtered back towards the royal family. But I don't think it's fair to argue that they are sustained by a kind of general taxation, as I think the question implies. And finally, the really important question is what replaces the monarchy? I think if you're a kind of small or large C conservative, you always have to think about what will actually be the outcome, what will come next. Countries that have some kind of president, which most countries do have some kind of head of state that is distinct from politics, is often itself a political figure, generally a retired politician of some variety. You end up with a situation where either you have an almighty politics, as you have in America, which I think brings its own problems and often vests too much power in the hands of that one individual, or you have figureheads that actually no one is not political. For example, the recent Irish President Michael D. Higgins, ex-politician, made some astonishing public pronouncements that were highly political and veered into conspiratorial anti-Semitism, not likely to unify. Therefore, there was that important role that monarchy brings, which is to provide a space where there's someone who is above politics, is lost. And I think at a time when almost everything is political and celebrities weighed in on every topic, et cetera, that's actually valuable, and I think we'd miss it when it was gone.
I agree with you, and I think the example of Ireland is instructive. I think that the most successful Irish president, Mary Robinson, was the one who most consciously seemed to channel our late Queen. The more obviously monarchical and free from political controversy a head of state is, the better. I feel sorry for Roderick. I feel sorry for anyone who's a Republican, because clearly their lives are so limited and barren and empty that they worry about the impact of the royal family on them and those close to them. And I'm sure Roderick's well-intentioned, but for anyone out there who's listening who's a Republican, I would urge you to get out there to enjoy a fuller and richer inner and outer life, because there's clearly a vacuum in your soul. The republicanism is to my mind, a form of emotional and intellectual distemper, because there is absolutely no evidence that getting rid of a monarchy improves the governance of any society. There is ample empirical evidence that the generally best governed countries are those that have monarchies or those that have presidential systems which are closer to monarchies. I could strain the point by saying that, even in somewhere like Singapore, which of course established itself as a republic, they've chosen to have a monarchical system. I could point out to the chagrin of the French that in the election of their presidents, the presidents who've been successful and the ones who seem to have most embodied, the spirit, whether that's Mitterrand, Giscard d'Estaing, de Gaulle himself, or even Sarkozy in his early stage, are all people who've aspired to be, monarchical, Jupiterian.
And also France does slightly put paid to that idea that you save money by getting rid of your monarchy. I mean,
I also think that people who are worried about unmerited power or unaccountable wealth, the royal family are the least of your problems. Jamie Dimon, Larry Fink, the people who run private equity and the big international banks, these are the dudes who determine your future and who genuinely do so with the carelessness of Olympian gods playing sport with the rest of us. So the endless agonizing over the future of the royal family is a distraction from where genuinely unaccountable power lies. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, a wrong un, but the king leads a life of service, and so does the Prince of Wales. And if he does have someone to squeeze his tube of toothpaste for him, in the greater scheme of things, this is a joyous eccentricity, and it has nothing as an abuse of power or a waste of money in comparison to what the masters of the universe get up to.
Well, if we were still in the medieval model of monarchy, probably by now Andrew Mountbatten Windsor would have launched some kind of a coup on his brother and would have been defeated on the battlefield, or we wouldn't be having this conversation at all. But I mean,
or you'd have been sent abroad to some crown colony to see out his days amidst the swamp fever and the turbulent internal machinations of some distant province.
Final observation on this question is just that it's one of those issues on which I think many in Britain, particularly on the left, they seem unable to view Britain as we are seen in the eyes of the world on this one particular issue.
Yes.
I think the monarchy has really shown its worth in the last few years. The king is by far the most important diplomat that we in this country possess.
Yes.
It was significant, I think, and probably had more to do with the king's intervention or fear of the king intervening, because it was known that the king was extremely unhappy about President Trump's disgraceful remarks about our contribution to the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. And he then put out a statement talking about the bravery of the British troops in particular. I do think that had a lot to do with the king's feelings, which were made known to the president. And that's just one example. The royal family are a real diplomatic asset, and many countries around the world, including in America, and that may have something to do with the fact that, that the monarchy holds a sort of mysticism to them because, they famously don't have one. But an invitation to Windsor Castle, I think, will often extract more from foreign dignitaries than anything else that we have to offer. So strategically would be a blunder. This is genuine soft power, not the kind of magic beans variety favoured by Keir Starmer and his lawyer mates.
100%.
The next question comes from Anon. With Dan Norris's arrest, do you think a by-election is near? Would Jacob Rees-Mogg be the Conservative candidate, and would he likely win? Now, this is the by-election North East Somerset, I think.
Yes, so we have to be careful to an extent. But the Labour MP Dan Norris, who used to be the MP for the constituency a long time ago, then became Mayor of West London, then became the MP again, defeating Jacob Rees-Mogg at the general election, faces a number of charges, and that's inevitably given rise to speculation as to whether or not there would be a by-election. Who is to say? Dan Norris may be completely innocent. The issue may pass. But would the House of Commons be better if Jacob Rees-Mogg were in it? Of course, undoubtedly. And I think that Jacob, if he were to return to the House of Commons, I think it would undeniably be an asset to have someone of his skill, experience, and passion there. Now, there's a question, of course, that's been raised over Jacob, which is, would he want to re-enter the House of Commons as Conservative and Reform? I'm 100% certain that Jacob would always remain a Conservative, would never defect. He does, however, believe that the Conservative Party, and for that matter, Reform, should do more to work together. And in that, he's swimming slightly against the tide within both parties.
Yes.
But my view that the return of Jacob to the House of Commons would be a good thing is not conditioned by my view that there should be a deal between the Conservatives and Reform. That's for others to talk about. I'm not convinced by the case for it, actually. But it is to do with the fact that Jacob is someone who is thoughtful, original, principled, and a proper parliamentarian.
Yes, agreed. The questioner also asks, would he be likely to win? And this is quite an interesting seat because although it's in the West Country area where the Lib Dems have traditionally cleaned up, it's really not a very Lib Dem coded seat at all. The last general election, they got fewer than 4,000 votes, and the combined Reform Conservative vote would have been enough to beat Dan Norris.
Yes.
This is kind of interesting because it suggests that the major rival to, if Jacob Rees-Mogg were to run, would be Reform UK. And this would pose quite an interesting question because it's probably one of those seats where, a bit like we were talking about recently with Andy Burnham and the Gorton and Denton by-election, that this is one of those seats where if they had Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think they'd be much more likely to win it. He's a candidate that it's harder for Reform UK to criticise, and indeed I'm sure they have been working very hard to try and convince him to defect. I think he would be a very much coveted scalp by Reform UK, but so far it hasn't happened. So although I think it could very easily go, if there were to be a by-election, we don't know the timeline for this because it really depends what happens to Dan Norris following his arrest. He's now been charged with offences, but we await the outcome of that. I think that would materially change things very much.
Yes, so it raises a number of questions. The first is, as you say, Labour held the seat in the past. There are some seats in the West Country where there has been a working class and a Labour tradition that's meant that the Lib Dems have not become the main opposition party. So obviously some parts of Plymouth, Exeter, and then there are some parts of Somerset where there is this agricultural working class tradition. So it's not a wash for the Lib Dems in the South West. Related to that is that at the last election, the electorate very smartly arranged itself behind whoever was best equipped to get rid of the Tories. Now we're in a different world. But there is one question that you quite rightly raise, which is, of course, thrown into sharp relief by the personality of Jacob, which is, would it be in Reform's interests, in the eyes of their supporters, to stand against certain Conservative figures? So, particularly in a by-election, would Reform feel that they had to stand in order to be a credible national party, but would it discredit them if they stood against Jacob? If it were the case that they were standing against Katie Lamb, for example, at the general election, might some Reform supporters say, why are you standing against her or against Jack Rankin in Windsor or
Nick Timothy,
You took the name off the top of my tongue, or Neil O'Brien. Some people might think this is needlessly self-destructive. So, again, I'm sure Reform would say, well, if these guys want to get with the programme, then they should, as Danny Kruger says, kneel before Nigel. So I suppose the argument works both ways, and I have to try to not check my privilege, but see through my bias. But it does provoke questions, and this potential by-election crystallises some of the tensions that people who might be voting either Conservative or Reform will feel about this fracture.
I don't think we should expect Reform UK to campaign less vigorously or even stand people down in these constituencies. Their raison d'etre right now is to eat the Conservative Party, and then when they've finished devouring the final entrails, move on to Keir Starmer. I mean, we can agree or disagree about the virtues of that as a strategy, but I think Nigel Farage, his line has always been, well, in 2019, we stood aside for Tory seats and we gifted Boris Johnson his large majority. And actually, interestingly, there's quite a few Labour luminaries that would not have kept their seats had it not been for the Brexit Party. If they had, yes. So like Yvette Cooper, Bridget Phillipson, they would probably have lost had it not been for Brexit Party. So it does give a sense of how much power they wielded in that general election, although obviously it didn't show up in the seats, and they feel betrayed because of how things went after that with Boris Johnson.
I think we both agree that all other things being equal, it would be a good thing for Jacob Rees-Mogg to be back in the House of Commons. Are there any other Conservatives who lost their seats in 2024 whom you would hope, under whatever colours, would be back in the House of Commons between now and the election or at the election? Is there anyone else that you'd want to bring back from the wilderness?
Who were some of the big names that lost their seat? It's obviously wasn't very long ago, but it's sort of hard to keep track.
Penny Mordaunt.
Penny Mordaunt was a fantastic Commons performer, so I think she would be an asset to them. I mean, no one has a God-given right to be anywhere. It has to be earned at the ballot box. Penny Mordaunt, I wonder if she actually would have kept that seat if it hadn't been for Rishi Sunak's blunder with the D-Day commemorations. It's such a seat that has such history with the armed forces. I don't know. I mean, I think she lost by, was it about 1,000 votes or something?
More or less, yeah.
Maybe that's to overestimate the impact of that one blunder. So I think some of the people who lost their seats would have held on to their seats if they were admired locally, if they had been a good local MP, and they were often loathed locally, and that has a lot to do with why they lost. Everyone thought Jeremy Hunt would lose, but he ran an excellent campaign in which he personally door-knocked half of his constituents. But I also wonder if there was some... Obviously, it was with the narrowest of margins, but there was some residual loyalty. Perhaps he'd done a good job for them locally, and that does matter. The Lib Dems understand this, to their credit. They understand that you have to be seen, visible in the local community. The Tory HQ had just parachuted people into seats in which they were spending perhaps more time in Westminster, and they weren't delivering for their constituents.
It is interesting that overall, and I threw you a perhaps unexpected question, that spontaneously, even though you've been a very close observer of the House of Commons, there aren't many, if any, of the 2024 losers whom you think, let's have them back. Obviously, there are some of us.
There may be ones I've forgotten, but off the top of my head.
But that's the revealing thing. So there are some of us who are now in the Lords. But what is interesting is that you didn't say, oh, please, unbidden to the front of my mind is bring them back. And I think that reinforces a particular thing, which is that the need for the Conservative Party, arguably the broader right, to look to the future rather than to attempt to go for retreads. I think, in a way, I may be over-interpreting, but instant reactions are revealing in their own way. And your instant reaction, I think, was a way of saying it is time to move on rather than trying to get a better yesterday.
It may also be that my job forces me to be trivial and consider only what makes for good copy in the here and now, and not thinking about the longer term political strategy behind something.
No. I think it is revealing. But of course, we make an exception for Jacob. Who knows what will happen in North East Somerset? Our next question comes from Phil Jr. And Phil asks, I've gone from being fairly left-leaning in my 20s to more centre-right in my late 30s, mostly due to work, responsibility, and seeing how institutions and incentives actually work in practice. Is there real evidence that people tend to shift politically right as they get older? If so, what's driving it? Psychology, economics, life experience, or something else? And does this pattern still hold for younger generations today?
Really interesting question. I think it is a documented phenomenon, but I think is sometimes overestimated. I think there are various academics have sort of looked into this officially and found that it does exist, but I think it can sometimes be exaggerated a little in public discussions. It does make sense. I think what it does suggest, though, and it's why politics cannot be complacent about this. Generally, it has happened that people shift rightwards as their lives change in a big way. They accrue material assets, put down milestones, things like getting married, having children. All of these things perhaps shift people in that way. But the flip side to that is that if these milestones are being postponed, if people can't acquire assets, if they can't get on the housing ladder, it's not going to happen. At the last general election, the average age of Conservative voter was higher than it has ever been before. And it's significantly higher even than the average age under, say, David Cameron, which was not that long ago. So basically, if people are kept in a kind of delayed adolescence because they cannot put down those milestones, then don't expect anyone to shift to the right. I've also noticed kind of anecdotally, people who have kids seem to move to the right after that. I wonder if when you're faced with like the facts of life in such a visceral way as having kids, it's harder to hold on to kind of utopian fantasies about how the world could be.
Yes.
For example, if you've seen children running around at home, you're maybe more likely to say, actually, there are inherent differences between the sexes.
I think that's completely correct. I think that when one is young, as a general rule, one chafes against restraint, and one is more idealistic and arguably utopian. So therefore, there is a resistance to authority and a general belief in the perfectibility of one's own life and the world by extension. So therefore, there is a tendency, all other things being equal, for people to be more radical and leftist when they're young. And then grim reality educates people, I think as a general rule, into some of the facts of human nature. And so I think you are right, and indeed Phil is, that recognising how incentives work, recognising that it's not to the disinterested generosity of the baker and the butcher that we owe our food, but to their ruthless pursuit of profit. That recognizing that there are differences between your son and your daughter, which are dictated by their biology. Recognizing that if you're in a working environment and there are other people who are swinging the lead, that goes the worse for you. All of these things are more inclined to make people more right-wing attitudinally. I think, however, you are also right to say that a big challenge is people are putting off having children, more reluctant to get married. There are a variety of reasons for that, but one of those reasons, inescapably, is the cost of housing and the difficulty of acquiring a secure home. It's been reduced to a syllogism that you can't have capitalists unless they have capital, and you can't have conservatives unless they have their own home that they own. I don't think it's quite as simple as that.
No.
But if you're going to boil it down to something, then I do think that it is an impediment to people being conservative. Not necessarily right-wing or radically right-wing, but conservative, that you make it more difficult for them to have a secure and stable home life.
I think part of the reason that we discuss that particular cause is that there are a range of causes, but that appears to be one in which politics may play a part. There are, I'm sure, lots of other more existential reasons, but that's not necessarily a matter for politicians. So they are more inclined to discuss the thing that they can control, which is how to build more houses, how to broaden opportunity and access to the trappings of adulthood.
I think that is correct. And I think it is true also that there will be some people when they're younger who, because of their desire to not be constrained in the choices that they make and because of their utopianism, will be on the radical right. So I think as a general rule, the movement through the ages is a movement away from radicalism and utopianism towards small c conservatism. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to vote for the Conservative Party,
no,
but it does mean that people are less likely to be utopian in their outlook the more that the world impinges on their lives. And again, one of the challenges for political parties at the moment, is that the fractured nature of the country's political economy means that the traditional roles and roots that people had within the political landscape are no longer as comfortable or as available as they were in the past.
Yeah. There is a difference between, because there are lots of people who will vote for, who will have voted for Labour at the last general election, but they're not leftists. No. They're not massively progressive. They're angry with the previous government, but also worried about their cost of living and a host of absolute eminently sensible reasons. There is actually, I think, quite a limited appeal for progressive campaigning and for what we might call wokeness.
Yes.
And that does not mean that everyone that votes for the left-wing party of the day subscribes to all of these issues. Where I think what I think is perhaps more significant is that there is also a greater resistance to that gradual kind of conservative shift, in that we have recently, so many more people have been going to university, and it's one of those things that's heavily aligned with progressive voting and belief. I'm very pro-university and pro-academia, but a lot of people are going to university that maybe in previous generations wouldn't have gone.
Yes.
And I think this has cultivated perhaps certain orthodoxies and beliefs and expectations that, well, we talked about this in our last podcast, but I do think that's a significant change from previous generations also that may impact the shift.
I think it is correct that the phenomenon of what's called elite overproduction may mean that you have a group of people who have been encouraged to think in a way about their own status and about the world, which means that reality is not commensurate with their ambitions or self-image, and that leads to discontent and arguably a greater openness to radicalism or to explanations of injustice. The idea that power is being exercised by people in a way which thwarts your flourishing. That is certainly true. The other thing, though, I think, point you make, which is very fair, is that I'm sure that there are people, and including people in my old constituency, who would have thought in 2024, do you know what? I can't vote Tory again, they've let me down. I'll vote for whoever's going to get them out. Is it the Lib Dem or the Labour Party? Who will now think, well, Labour have proved useless and immensely disappointed. The Lib Dems have done nothing, noticeable in the last 2 years. The Tories, well, it's too soon to go back to them. They need to repent more. Reform, well, I'm not convinced that there's much more to them than a Nigel fan club, and it's too soon to judge. The Greens, come off it. Zach Polansky, the man's mad. So what am I going to do? So I do think that there are...
I think some people in this room have had that thought.
I think that there are people who it would be wrong to pigeonhole as either left or right wing, and who you certainly cannot allocate to any political party at the moment. And that is why I think that with so much in flux, predictions about what will happen at the next general election are very difficult to make.